Finally, moving toward cities. I think there are two natural questions to ask given everything we've just been discussing. And these two questions that come to mind are, why don't cities seem to die the way that organisms do? They just keep growing. And then, I mean, like Rome. Rome's a good example. It's been hard to kill over the centuries.
Can't kill cities.
Then the other question, I'm sure it's tied to this, is how the metabolism of cities scales with size.
Yes, very good. Yeah, so, having done all this work, it was very natural to think about extending it to cities and companies, because they're both network systems, and both in the literature you often biological or organismic and metaphors are used to describe them very often in the literature. So it's very natural to turn to them and ask the kinds of questions you just asked. And in fact, the question that inspired me was exactly the one you asked. Why is it that cities seem to be, on the scale of human life anyway, sort of immortal? Or put it slightly different, it's extremely difficult to kill a city. We, of course, know ones that have died, especially in more ancient times. But, the example I give is, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We dropped atom bombs on them. And 25 years later, they're sort of up and thriving. So it's very hard to kill them. I mean, people talked about the death of Detroit and New Orleans, which was completely absurd. And both are doing fine. So it's hard to kill a city. And the question I ask is, why is it hard to kill a city, but simple to kill a company? It's kind of bizarre to think that we don't have a TWA or a Pan Am or Sears Roebuck or Montgomery Wards. And it's weird to think that one day we may not have a Google or a Microsoft. I mean, when they're powerful and strong, it seems like they're going to be around forever. But the history has been that they don't live. In fact, the analysis we did eventually was to show that even once you've posted on the New York Stock Exchange, so you've gone public, so you've gone through a gestation period and you think you're strong, your expected lifespan is about 10 years. So most publicly traded companies aren't going to last very long. It's very unusual for a company to last even 50 years. And some companies can last several hundred years, but very, very few. So there's that difference. Whereas a city, as you just said, Rome or Baghdad, they're still here. And they also, roughly speaking, keep growing. So what is that? So it was natural to take this work and ask a series of questions that we asked in biology, and in particular ones, do cities scale? Is, just as I said whimsically, you're a scaled down elephant and a blown up mouse, is Los Angeles a scaled down New York and a scaled up Chicago, which is a scaled up Santa Fe, even though, like the animals, they look completely different. They have different histories, geographies, even different cultures. But we do recognize all of them as cities, just as we recognize all those things as mammals. And indeed, once you start thinking about it, your first thought is, gee whiz, Los Angeles and New York, they're so different. But, as you actually think about it as to what it is, you realize actually almost everything about them is the same, because they all have people, they all have buildings, they have roads, they have, et cetera, et cetera. They all have all the same things, and they have to have all those same things. They all, they have to have garbage workers and they have to have lawyers, so it's like, well, maybe all those differences are rather superficial. And as I said, they're networks. And the important thing to recognize is the obvious networks, the roads and the electrical lines, and water lines, that's one thing. But it turns out the most important thing, and this is the most important thing about a city, is its social networks. It's the networks of people. And to recognize that the whole point of a city is not all those buildings and roads and so on. That is just infrastructure or a stage, a facilitator to encourage social interaction. And the essence of a city, I know it sounds almost obvious, is to encourage social interaction in order to produce wealth and innovate, create ideas, and in order to raise quality of standard of life. And that's what they are. And it's, even though it may sound obvious, that has not been obvious in the history of urban studies, urban geography, urban development, political development of cities, and so on. It's always been focused on buildings. In fact, it almost always is. It's always focused on building new stuff. Look at the way you are, Stanford campus. My God almighty, it's all buildings,
Yes, it is.
names on it.
Crowding up everywhere.
Everywhere, and that's what every university is, and so anyway, but it's very similar. That's the focus, and it's very easy to forget why they're there. So that's important. Anyway, so it turned out, unlike the biology, I didn't say this. I did say Kaiba's law had been known since the 30s. Well, I guess I did say that all these other laws, many of them, were discovered or exposed in the 30s and 40s and 50s, even into the 60s. But the urban scaling, urban cities had not been looked at this way. Basically, there was almost no work had been done on. So this was a more difficult project in the sense that we also had to do a lot of data gathering, and luckily, by the time we turned our attention to that, we, by the way, was not the people. I had to also, I'd worked with biologists, ecologists. It was a highly multidisciplinary group with the biology, but very little of that carried over to the cities. So I had to form new collaborations, and one of the main ones was someone had been a postdoc also in high-energy physics at Los Alamos, a man named Luis Betancourt, who joined me at the Santa Fe Institute, eventually moved there, and then now runs some fancy schmancy institute funded to some humongous degree in the University of Chicago. He's the director there. But he and then others, Jose Lobo, others, but the task was then, scraping around looking for data to ask, do cities scale? Is New York scaled up Los Angeles and scaled up Santa Fe? Well, we got all that data, and we got it on there are two parts, and the data separated into two parts, and the way I've already talked about it. That is, one was its physicality, the infrastructure, the buildings. So one of the first things we discovered, in fact, the first thing we discovered, I actually had the first work was with some European colleagues before the major collaboration, a man named Dirk Helbing at the ETH in Zurich, and his student. And what did we do? We found, I think the first thing was showing that gasoline stations scaled. So you plotted the number of gasoline stations versus the size of a city. And these were in European countries, and they scaled beautifully. And it looked just like biology. Exactly, it was sublinear, meaning it didn't go linearly, which meant that the bigger the city, the less gas stations you need per capita. Well, subsequently, with the bigger collaboration, we did this for all infrastructure, and we discovered that that any infrastructure, such as gas stations, length of all the roads, the electrical lines, buildings, and so on, all scaled as if it were biology, as if it were just an organism. That is, it had this economy of scale. So, but the only difference being, instead of 25% saving with each doubling, you have a 15% saving. So that a bigger city is more efficient in that sense than a smaller city, in the same sense that a bigger organism is more efficient than a smaller one. So, except for this 15 versus 25%. So that was very nice and very satisfying. And, we could imagine having a theory very similar to the biological theory based on networks. So that was very nice. But we also started looking at socioeconomic quantities, which are really the essence of a city. And that is things like, the number of flu cases, the amount of AIDS cases, the wealth, the wages in a city, the number of patents produced in a city, therefore how innovative a city was, and the number of restaurants in a city. Anything you could get that was socioeconomic in character. And we discovered something remarkable, namely that they all scaled in the same way, pretty much. And they all scaled. First of all, they all scaled. They scaled in a similar way, meaning the slope of the graphs plotted in this logarithmic fashion were similar, roughly around 1.15. So the other thing we discovered, they were bigger than 1 rather than less than 1. And that was, and in fact, one of the things that I am embarrassed about, which I will say publicly, is that I didn't predict that. I didn't predict a priori. If we look at socioeconomic quantities, they're going to be bigger than 1, namely instead of the bigger you are, the less per capita, that is the less roads and gas stations per capita, like biology. But when you come to socioeconomic phenomena, if you think about it, you would have expected the bigger you are, the more per capita, the more people, the more interactions, the more ideas, the more disease, the more crime, the more wages, the higher the wages. And I didn't. In fact, the first time I saw the data at our little gathering in a group, I said to the student, "You got it wrong. That can't be right." Because he got this 1.15. I said, "Screwed up somewhere." And then he said, "No, I really was careful." And I said, "No, you're wrong." Then a half hour later, as I sat there mulling over, I said, "Oh my God, what a schmuck. It's obviously it should have been superlinear." So it was an interesting exercise, actually. So, and the amazing thing is not only all socioeconomic metrics scaled similarly, but it was the same across the globe, whether you looked in North America, Central America, Latin America, China, Japan, Europe, all looked the same. I mean, roughly speaking. And that was amazing. That meant that there was a universal dynamic that was going on, which was wonderful. Now we have the same kind of thing as in biology, so it was almost as if, I used to say this, as if along comes the Industrial Revolution and urbanization starts to slowly take off. And there was a big international convention in, let's say 1805. And they bring all the leaders of the world together and they say, "Look, we've just got this Industrial Revolution and we're going to be building lots of cities. Let's sit down and decide how we're going to build them. And we're all going to follow the same plan," and so on. It was almost as if this had happened. Of course, it hadn't. In fact, all cities look different, and they're certainly across the globe. And yet, their systematics are the same. They all follow the same scaling laws, and there's kind of universality. And then you think, how in the hell did that happen? And then you realize, of course, that's what got me. I quickly realized, of course, the reason is that because I was still, when I first saw this, I was still thinking of cities primarily as buildings, infrastructure. Then I said, oh my God, of course. It's of course because cities are people. It's the people that are forcing all these things. It's the way people interact. It's social interactions. It's social networks. And social networking and social interactions between people are roughly the same across the globe. Roughly, independent of geography, culture, and history. We're human beings. We do recognize that people in Asia and Africa and Europe and America, we're the same thing. And we know our DNA is almost identical. And so it's not surprising that the thing we produce that facilitates our social interaction should be the same in terms of these properties that you can measure. I'm taking very much a physicist view, things you can measure. And so that's sort of interesting. That means you could start forming real theory, which is quite challenging because you have two networks at play now. You have the infrastructural networks and the social networks, and they behave differently. And they're completely integrated. I mean, you're part of two networks. You're part of, that infrastructural network that is Stanford, which is part of a bigger network, which is the Bay Area, and so on and so forth, California. So you're part of all that infrastructure, but you're also part of course, probably more importantly, part of a social network. You have your friends, you have your colleagues, and you have your family, and that's who you are. And those two are not independent. You're sitting on a network, on an infrastructural network. You're going to interact with your family through that infrastructure. So that's very hard to put into mathematics. But anyway, so that's where all that stands. And it's quite powerful to think of it all as sort of universal and all pretty much the same thing, and that you can have a real theory, science-based theory of cities to complement all the marvelous stuff that's been done before, which is much more kind of social science and more qualitative in its nature. And so this work has, for want of a better phrase, been called the science of cities. I'm not sure that's a very good phrase, actually. I don't like it particularly. It's come under that kind of umbrella. But it's now, when I started this, I wasn't terribly enthusiastic about it. I didn't think cities were so exciting and interesting. But as I got into it and I saw this marvelous patterns emerging, I got more and more interested and excited. But then I got truly excited when I realized that the whole future of the planet is completely dependent upon cities. And so if you're thinking about global sustainability, and therefore all the things that come under that umbrella, from global warming to energy and water and resources in general, financial markets and so on, all come under that. You better think about cities, and you better understand what that dynamic is. And so one of the things that I have moved into in very recently, work in progress, is taking these ideas for the whole planet, taking the whole thing and applying the same kind of thing and looking at global metrics and so on. And that's been quite fascinating, and it's quite, I don't know, depressing in a way, I'm afraid. It doesn't look for a good outlook if you look at the way these metrics are evolving within this framework. But anyway, so that's where that work stands. One of the major things I haven't talked about, and I'm happy to do so, which has profound consequences, is growth, which I only talked briefly about. I talked about for organisms that it was the sublinear economy of scale, 3/4 power, less than 1, behavior of the supply, the metabolic rate, not being able to keep up with the growth, with the adding of cells, that leads to the cessation of growth. Here we have the opposite. We have that superlinear scaling. Now you have the opposite. Instead of supply not keeping up with demand, demand can't keep up with supply. I mean, supply completely overwhelms demand. And that's the society we live in. That's what gives us this great society we live in. We keep making more and more, and we have all these marvelous things because of that supply being superlinear. And so that's great. That's been wonderful. And the theory explains it through social networks. The fact that we doing things like this builds on things, and we build on more, and it gives rise to superlinear. But it has, and I don't know if you want me to talk about it, some very dark consequences, potentially dark consequences.
Mm-hmm. Well, sure. We'll move on to that, but just to recapitulate briefly, I mean, while organisms and cities both scale, the one sublinearly and the other superlinearly, organisms slow down with size, but cities speed up. And you attribute this to human psychology and the way we interact. And maybe a good example of concretizing this is with that patent example you gave, where if you take one guru on a mountaintop, you don't get patents, but the more people connect with one another, the more patents you get. And this results in what you didn't use this phrase in our conversation, I don't think, but in scale you refer to it as the continually increasing pace of life. People walk more quickly in cities.
Exactly. So that's the other consequence of this theory. Just as in biology, I said the bigger, I don't know if I emphasized that, but things slow down the bigger you are. Well, I talked about slower heart rates, but in general, the pace of life is much slower and you live much longer. In cities, the pace of life increases systematically with size. Things go faster. And in fact, viscerally, I think we all feel that. I mean, my God, pace of life now compared to when I was even your age, and certainly when I was a boy, is phenomenal. And in fact, that has huge psychological implications as well, because there's also that, when I was growing up, and probably even at your age, there was still this presumption that things don't change very quickly. I mean, we knew that, but, I'm in the same job for the rest of my life kind of image, which was certainly true in my father's time, but it was even true when I grew up. I mean, you choose a profession, you move into it, and that's what you're going to be doing. But not just a profession, but even in a job, you sort of expect to stay climbing up the ladder and so on. That was sort of the image. Of course, there were lots of changes and things and so on. But now that's, things, people are changing willy-nilly very fast, and society around you. I mean, my God, until last year, I had an iPhone 6. And these buggers at Apple, your neighbors down the road, of course, as part of the capitalist system, stopped supporting it. So the thing became basically dysfunctional. It worked fine, just became dysfunctional. You couldn't use it, nothing worked on it because they never upgraded and you couldn't upgrade. And it was getting more and more frustrating and I was getting more and more annoyed. So I bit the bullet last year. And I bought my wonderful, lovely, it is so much better than the iPhone 6, no question, 14. But of course, like you, all last week and today, I get inundated to get the iPhone 15.
Yes.
1 year later, I mean, what kind of this is completely nuts. Every year it's like, with all kinds of other bells and whistles, the best camera they've ever had. This camera is so much, I mean, who cares? So I'm sorry, this is polemics and I'm running off the rails here. But that is the way life is, faster and faster. And it has all kinds of interesting social, psychological consequences, which I think are playing out on the political scene. And we can maybe come back to that in a minute. But that is certainly what it is. And the data supports that life, it's hard to measure. What are the right metrics to measure? Well, there was this old data that you mentioned, I think you just said it, that we found that some people at Princeton had done on the speed of walking in cities that increased, and they followed pretty much what we said. But, the pace of life, I think everybody would agree, has definitely increased. Whether it agrees precisely with our theory, I don't know. We don't have enough data. But I was going to say one thing that is important that brings up cell phones is that this idea that it's all to do with social networks, and the theory kind of conceptual framework is based on that. We've found a way of testing because our dear friends at MIT met a crazy, wonderful man named Carlo Ratti, who was a very fine architect and scientist, had got very turned on to the idea, he wasn't unique, but he got turned on, that you could use cell phones as a detector, that everybody has one. So if you get hold of the cell phone data, you know what everybody's doing, so you can measure social networks. Well, this is now been much used and well known. So we were some of the first to do that. And we got billions and billions of data of phone calls between people. And then we just measured the degree of social interaction based on those phone calls. It took a lot of analysis, detailed analysis of that. And it was very simple, the idea, you call me and 6 months later I call you back. We define that we have a relationship. So that's an interaction. You could make it 3 months, you could make it 2 weeks. So 6 months was kind of arbitrary, but and you can change that to see how it affects the results. It doesn't much. But so you measure, and what you find is the prediction would be, if this theory is right, the number of social interactions as a function of city size should increase like this 1.15, like everything else. Sure enough, it did. So that was extremely satisfying. But let's see, I forget what question you asked originally on this line about...
Well, I didn't really have a question. I was just commenting on the pace of life increase that comes with this superlinear growth. But maybe this is a good time to segue, to use that word again, into the concerns, the sustainability of this unconstrained growth.
So one is this pace of life increasing, that somehow that's the price you pay. The price you pay for getting more ideas, more action, a sexier life, more opportunities, more buzz, and therefore, increasing by, material metrics anyway, material and quality of life, the price you pay is that it goes faster. That's one price. And I'll come back to what that might mean in a moment. But the other price is to do with growth. So one of the nice things is that this superlinear behavior, this more per capita the bigger you are, the consequence of that is that the supply is always outgrowing the demand. You're just getting more. Of course, that's what we have, all this excess, which goes into all the wonderful things we have. And that's great. So the theory is very nice because it kind of explains all that. But it has a very bad consequence, and that is goes under the name mathematically of something called a finite time singularity. And what that means in English is in some finite time in the future. Could be next week, could be next year, could be 50 years, but some finite time in the future, this growing curve that we all see and we're all part of, and it's exponential, by the way, faster than exponential, becomes infinite, which is completely loony. You can't have infinite number of AIDS cases or an infinite GDP or infinite number of patents. It's loony. And the theory tells you it's loony because it tells you that the system collapses. The system then collapses. It comes up to this so-called singularity and collapses. And the mathematics of that, interestingly, is essentially identical to the mathematics that happens in a phase transition when, say, propane changes from a liquid to a gas. Something changes from the completely same stuff, same say propane, but in one form it's a liquid and all interconnected and together. On the other side of this transition, this phase transition, it's a gas, not interacting, not connected with each other. Well, it's the mathematics of what's the singularity, this finite, is very similar to that. So that's very bad. We don't want that. We don't want, most of us like what we have. We like this socioeconomic system for all its faults. And we've learned how to avoid it. We know how to avoid it. And this argument, of course, is the old argument begun by Thomas Malthus, who pointed out in 1780 or whatever, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where he already saw the beginnings of exponential growth, that he said this was not sustainable because you can't supply enough food to keep up with it. And he had in mind you just have linear growth of food, and that always gets beaten quite quickly by an exponential. And everybody poo-pooed it. Those are rightly, economists and Marxists, Marx himself poo-pooed it. Because Marx poo-pooed it, by the way, and many on which you would consider the left poo-pooed it, because he felt that it would lead to draconian consequences of the way society, if you took that literally, you would start stopping people, you'd have forced stopping people having babies, and you would kill off people. I mean, all kinds of terrible is what he thought. Anyway, on the other hand, it did influence Darwin in terms of survival of the fittest, very much so. But economists said, look, this is totally simplistic because we innovate. It's not going to stay linear. We're going to find clever ways of producing food. And they're exactly right. And we've kept ahead of the curve the whole way in terms of food, including the famous Green Revolution of 50 years ago. Marvelous. But more importantly is that this approaching the singularity is cut off by having an innovation. So the idea is that you grow in this exponential or faster than exponential phase. You would hit a singularity and collapse, but you recognize that you can intervene by changing some conditions because that growth has taken place within a certain given paradigm or major innovation. You've discovered bronze. That's why we say the Bronze Age, or iron, the Iron Age, or computer age. Now we call it the IT age and so on. There's something that sort of dominates that period and that time and the way society behaves. And we're in one of those now, which is sort of the internet age, if you like, or some version of that. And so that leads, if you think about it, to what you have to do. If you're approaching this collapse, you have to intervene with some major innovation, some major paradigm shift. You have to reinvent yourself and start over again. So you grow, you intervene, you're going to collapse, you intervene, you start over again. But you're going to hit another singularity, so you better intervene again. So what it says is if you want to maintain open-ended growth the way we have, you have to have sequence of innovations or paradigm shifts, reinvent yourself. And well, that's what we've done. That's why we have all these different, we designate them. And that's great, but you don't get that for free either. That gets you out of the problem. But it has become, basically the dictum of economists and politicians. Whole society is based on that idea that you don't have to worry about that. You don't even have to worry about population growth because we're always going to innovate. We've done it and we're going to keep doing it. We just keep innovating, and we have. I mean, it's true. Absolutely. But here's the kicker. The problem is, in the theory at least, and indeed all the data strongly supports it, previous data, that you have to do it faster and faster in a systematic way. So, the time between, the Iron Age and the Bronze Age, was thousands of years, but the time between computers and the internet were 15 years. So, and the theory tells you how fast you speed up. And so you can make a kind of reductio ad absurdum argument that, yes, you can innovate to get yourself out of it, but it's not a solution. All it does is postpone. So that's the thing I introduce into it. All it does is postpone, and you got to do it again, but you have to do it much quicker this time. And next time, even quicker. So the reductio ad absurdum is you have to make a major innovation like the internet or AI kind of every year, which is nuts. You can't do that. I mean, Apple may think they're doing it with this, but I'm talking about something, not some trivial 14 to 15 innovation, but some true innovation like the internet or what may be one like artificial intelligence. I don't know. So, and so you can't keep it up. So my image that I have in my head is one of being on treadmills. You're on a treadmill that's accelerating. That's the accelerating pace of life. But, at some stage, you're going to have to jump to another treadmill that is also accelerating, and that goes faster. And then you have to jump to another treadmill. But the trouble is, not only is each treadmill going faster, but you're going to have to jump from one treadmill to another at a faster and faster rate. So it's almost like a double exponent. I mean, it's like crazy. It's hard not to believe that the system isn't going to have a heart attack. and collapse under that. So that's what it is. So the most recent work I've been involved in is to take data. So this is what I thought when we did this work on cities and thinking about it for the entire planet 20 years ago when we first did this work, or whenever the hell we did that work, maybe less than 15 years ago. But the data wasn't around, so I put it aside. And my collaborators, I think, thought I was a bit overly speculative, let's put it that way. But I then learned about a year or so ago, just as COVID was beginning, that someone named Will Steffen, who's one of the great proponents of the idea of the Anthropocene, an Australian who sadly died just a few months ago, had put together a whole bunch of global data. So treating the globe as a whole in the same way we were treating a city as a whole. So we took this data, and I had the equations all worked out, and lo and behold, it fit beautifully, the equations, and it projected a singularity, that we're heading boing, right towards a singularity. It's very hard, given the quality of the data and the way the mathematics work, to predict with any precision, unfortunately, at the moment. It's very much a work in progress. When that will be, it could be as soon as 15 years, might be 30 years. We're honing us. Work is definitely work in progress. And this work may turn out to be rubbish. I hope not. That's the data. And it's not published, so it shouldn't be taken too seriously, frankly. But I believe it. But it needs a lot more work. But it's just taking this idea that we did for the cities, and as I say, just doing it for the planet as a whole. And it's very suggestive. So we'll see where that goes.